Hey everybody, it's Chris from Xano, and today I'm super excited to give you a walkthrough of the backend for the Wized Maya Cloneable. Maya is a bulk ordering platform that allows interactions from both suppliers and customers. The whole project is fully clonable and consists of three parts. We have our Xano backend, we have the Wized application, and we have the Webflow front end. Definitely make sure to check out the Wized YouTube channel for additional information and walkthroughs for this template. From the Xano side, we're going to walk through how the backend works. So we're going to look at some of the actions that the application is taking, and we'll take you through those function stacks inside Xano so you can learn exactly how they work and how to build them yourself. If you're brand new to Xano, that's totally fine. I'm going to make sure to give you a quick crash course in kind of what we're about. So let's go ahead and jump into the template and let's start to use it a little bit. So here we are at the home page. We have our menu up at the top and then some product listings down below. Let's actually go ahead and sign up for the application. So we'll click sign up and we'll go ahead and enter in some of our information here and click register. And you can see we are now signed in. We're presented with a log out button instead of log in and sign up. And now we're going to jump over to Xano and let's take a look at what just happened. So this is the Xano backend for the project. And if you're not familiar with Xano, what we offer is a no-code solution to building a backend for your application. The backend is what contains all of your data. It contains your APIs and all of the logic that is executed behind the scenes to make your application work, as well as the infrastructure that powers that backend, so your server, basically. What we offer is a no code solution for you to build that backend. We maintain all of the infrastructure for you to save you time and resources when developing this major part of your application. This is the dashboard for the Maya Cloneable backend. And on the dashboard, we're presented with just a bird's eye view of kind of everything that's happening in our application. We have some information on our database tables, and we have information on the requests that are being made to our Xano APIs. So let's take a look at our user table. We just signed up for the application, so let's actually just take a look at that record. So we can see here down at the bottom that information that I entered is now inserted into the user table. But how did that actually happen? That is thanks to this Auth signup API endpoint. So this is an API that is specifically designed to, of course, sign users up to our platform. This is the no-code API builder. The no-code API builder is split into three sections. The first section is our inputs. So what information does this API endpoint actually need before it can begin executing? In this example, because this is a sign up endpoint, we have three pieces of information that we need. We need the name, the email, and the password, which corresponds directly to what we filled out in our form earlier. The second section is the function stack. The function stack is where all of the actual logic lives for this API endpoint. What are we doing with this data? All of that happens inside of the function stack. And the third section is the response. Once we've taken in those inputs and we've performed all of the logic in our function stack, what are we returning back to our application? So for this sign up API endpoint, we're taking in the name, the email, and the password. And then in our function stack, the first thing we're doing is we are checking to make sure that this user doesn't already exist on our platform. Obviously, we don't want them to be signing up again if they already have an account. So that is handled by two steps. The first step is to get a record from the user table. And what we're doing is we're looking at the email column inside of our user table, and we're checking to see if any of those records contain the email address that was provided by the user. If that email address already exists in our user table, then we're going to return an error message that says this account is already in use. If that record does not exist, that means that this user has not signed up with this email address. So we can go ahead and proceed to create an account. We are then adding that user to our user table. So we're taking in those inputs and we're just adding those to our table. And finally, we are creating an authentication token. Now, this means that once the user is logged in, we need to make sure that they have a way to maintain that authentication so they can continue to make requests on behalf of themselves, like placing orders or checking order history. So we use an authentication token to make sure that those endpoints stay secure So that user is only able to see information that belongs to them. And in our response, what is this endpoint returning once all of this logic has completed? We're just returning that authentication token because we need to make sure that our application hangs on to that for future authenticated requests. Now, we'll go through the rest of the application and I'll show you some more of these actions and what's happening on the Xano side, but I did want to give a quick walkthrough of the no code API builder for those of you that may be new to our platform. So let's go back to the application and let's see what else we can see here. So on the home page, we of course have our list of products here. Back in our Xano backend, we have actually 4 tables here, but for this example, we're going to take a look at the products table. And you can see we have our product listing here. And that matches what we have available on our front end. So we have our AirPods, our iPad, our MacBook, and our Surface. And we can see that that is what is listed in our backend on the products table. So let's take a look at the API that's actually returning these products to our front end. So we can go over here, and what we're looking for is this get products API endpoint. So what this API does is this just queries all records from the products table and it returns those in the response. So let's just run this in Xano. We're typically going to focus on what's happening on the application side, but we can actually just take a look and kind of see the raw results just so you can get an idea of what Wized is actually doing here. So this is the data that Xano is sending to our Wized application. So you can see we have the title of the product, the price, the stock, the category, and we have our image data as well. And we have those for all of the products in our table. So what Wized is doing is Wized is taking the data that is returned by this API and dynamically populating it in your Webflow project. What you would normally have to do to process this data is to essentially just use some custom JavaScript to read the data, look through your page, find the elements to populate, and populate them. But thanks to the power of using Wized with your Xano backend and your Webflow project, that is no longer necessary. Just to give you a more practical example of what's happening here with this data on our front end, let's just add a new product. Let's say I'm going to add a Mac Studio. We'll go ahead and add an image and let's set a price. We can set our stock and our category. Let's just put it in laptops. We don't have to make a new category. But you can see when I refresh my page, our Mac Studio product is now available, just like that. Let's say we want to change the price on the iPad mini. So we can go back to our products table and we can find the record for the iPad mini. And let's say this is now $8.99. So we can just change that record and refresh the page. And now it says $8.99 instead of $9.99. So that was just to show you that direct connection between our Xano data and our front end. So let's take a look at another action. Let's say I want to add something to my cart. So I'm going to scroll down here and I'm going to add 10 MacBook Airs to my cart. So we'll click that add to cart button and we can go up to our cart and we can see that those MacBooks have been added. But what just happened on the Xano side? Let's take a look. So we can go to our database and we can go to the cart table. So this table is using some relational data. So this is a feature that allows you to make data in different tables relate to each other. So when we think about a shopping cart, what information do we need for that? We need to know what user the cart belongs to. We need to know what's in it and we need to know the amount of what's in it. So we have 2 fields here that are table reference fields. So these are referring to other tables. We're referring to our users table and our product table. And then finally, we have our quantity. So we can see in the latest record in this table, I have my user, my quantity, and my product. And this was all taken care of by this post cart API endpoint. This API is taking in a user ID, the quantity, and the product ID as inputs. We have one step in the function stack, which is just to add that record to our cart table. And then finally, we are then returning that cart record that we just added as our response. So we take in the data, we add the record to our table, and we take that data and we return it back to our front end. Very similarly, we can take a look at what happens when we remove an item from the cart. So let's go ahead and click this remove button. You can see our cart is now empty. Let's go back to Xano and let's take a look at our table. We can see that that entry is completely gone. So what happened here is our Wized application took that data that related to our cart and it was sent to a delete cart API endpoint. So we have one input, which is just the ID of our cart. We're getting the record from the cart table, and we're doing that again, similarly to the sign up API endpoint. We're doing that so we can check to make sure this cart actually exists. Is there a cart for this user? If there is, then we can proceed to delete that record from our cart table. Let's go ahead and add those back to our cart. And let's click the Order Now button and let's see what happens. So you can see I have the first order that we've placed here. That is order number 68, and it is for 10 MacBook Airs. And of course, we are calling a Xano API to do a couple of things here. We are checking to make sure that this user is authenticated. So are we logged in? And then we're getting that information that belongs specifically to me, the user. So this is the first API endpoint that's being called, and this is the auth me endpoint. What this does is this takes that authentication token that we were given earlier, it sends that token back to Xano, and Xano checks to make sure that authentication token is valid. If it is valid, then we return the user record from the user table as our response. If it's not, then of course this fails and the user has to log in again. Now, the really important thing, of course, with authentication is you want to make sure that a user is only seeing data that belongs to them. So how do we do that? Well, if we click on this get record from user table step, you can see we are searching through the ID field in our table, and we are looking for this auth ID value. So auth ID is a value that Xano maintains for you. There is an auth ID for each authentication token. And what we're doing is we are taking that authentication token once we've determined it's valid, and we are taking the user ID out of that so we can use that to query our user table. So that token contains some user information. One of those pieces of information is the ID of that user. So we use that to look up their record in the user table. So now that we've determined that this user is logged in, how are we displaying their order history? That is handled by this orders/order ID endpoint. In this endpoint, we have one input, which is just the order ID. And the first thing we're doing is we're just getting that order from our order table. We're using a precondition. And in this precondition, we're checking to make sure that this order actually exists. If the order doesn't exist, then we return a not found error. But if it does exist, we can continue. We are then getting the user record from our user table. And then we are creating a variable called total. The total variable is, as the name implies, just keeping track of the total cost of our order. We are then using a for each loop, and this for each loop is actually going through each of the products in our order, and it is calculating a total. We are then updating this order.total price variable, and what's happening here is we are using dot notation to edit this order variable that is returned in step one. So in step one, we get that data from our order table. We are then adding a value to that order variable that has the total cost of that order. And finally, in our response, we are returning that order variable. So once we've calculated these totals, we're then returning that data back to our front end. Now you can see there's another step here that says if user one is admin equals yes. And we're actually going to go ahead and take a look at that. So if you recall in our user table, we have this additional field here that says is admin. And we can see our account is currently set to no. This clonable also provides you with administrator features if you need to manage your customers. So what we can do is we can change this value to yes. And just like that, we are now an administrator. So let's go back to our template and let's just go ahead and refresh the page and we will head to our dashboard. Looks like we need to log in again. So let's go ahead and log in. So now that we've logged in and we are an administrator, you can see that we have quite a bit more information available to us. So we have all of our users here, we have their roles listed, and it looks like we can actually delete users here as well. We can check the inventory. You can see we have all of our products listed here. We have the ability to add stock to these items. And we can, of course, see our order history of the entire platform. So we can take a look at all of these orders that are being placed. So how is this working on the Xano side? This is powered by our Get Orders API endpoint. You can see up here at the top, this endpoint does require authentication, which means that we are sending that authentication token to Xano, and Xano is using that auth token to get the record from the user table that belongs to that user. And then we are checking to see if this user is an administrator. You can see it says if user1, which is the variable that contains that user record that is returned in step 1, is admin equals yes. So we're checking that is admin field in our database table, and we are checking to make sure that they are an administrator. If they are, then we query our orders table to get every single order that's in that table. We're not dialing it down to a specific user this time. We want them all. So we're just querying that table. And then similarly to looking at our individual order history, we are then creating a total variable, and we are looping through each of those orders, and we are calculating the total for the products that were ordered. And then we are updating that in the orders variable. So we create our quantity sum variable. We update that variable by multiplying the quantity with the price, and then we update the order total by adding that previous value to that new total. So this allows us to see all of the orders and all of the totals because we are an administrator, as checked by this conditional statement. If we are not an administrator, then what happens? Well, we still query the orders database table, but you can see here we have, it looks like a custom query, and if we look at the expression builder for this custom query, you can see we are checking the user ID field in the orders table, and we're making sure that equals the auth ID. And again, the auth ID is maintained by Xano, and it is pulled right out of that authentication token that we're providing when we actually call this endpoint. That means that we are only returned orders that belong to the user specified in the authentication token, which is of course us because it is our authentication token. But because we are an administrator, we are seeing all of the orders. We have a button here to see the order details, so let's go ahead and click that. Just like when we were looking at our own order, you can see we have our order number, the date, and the total. So let's take a look at the user management screen. So you can see here, because again, I am an administrator, I can see and manage all of the user accounts that are present in the application. And what's happening here is we are first, of course, calling an endpoint in Xano to get all of the users. So let's take a look at that API endpoint. And that is going to be our get user API. So this API does require authentication. So we're passing that auth token back to Xano. So Xano knows that we are authorized to receive this information. And then we are simply querying all of the records from our user table and then returning all of those records, which are then displayed in the application. Now, let's say I want to delete a user. So I do have an option here, and I've created a dummy user account that we can use for this example. So what I can do is I can click delete user. We get a refresh on our list, and we can see that that user is now gone. But what happened on the Xano side? So this is the API that was executed when we deleted the user. This endpoint does require authentication, as expected, and we have an input for the user ID. So the first step in this function stack is we are getting a record from the user table, and this record is the authenticated user. So again, we take that auth token, Xano pulls the ID out of that auth token and gets the record that belongs to that authenticated user, to that user that's making the request to this API. We are then using a precondition to determine whether or not this user is an administrator. If they are an administrator, then we can proceed with the execution. If they are not, then we return an error that says that you don't have permission to delete records. And the third and final step in our function stack is simply to delete the record in the user table. And we do that by looking at the ID column in the user table and using the input of the user ID to search through the table. And just so you can see exactly the input that was given to Xano, we can actually take a look at our request history here. And the request history will show you the details of all of the incoming requests for your Xano API. So for this API, the user ID is actually provided as part of the URL. You can see in the upper left-hand corner, we have user ID in curly brackets. So this denotes a URL parameter. And we can see the URL that we called for this API has a 116, which is the ID of the user that we removed. Now, this API does not have a response, so we were not returned any data because in this case, we don't really need to be. All we're doing is deleting a user and refreshing our list. All right, so that was a quick run through of the backend for the Wized Maya Cloneable. Again, make sure to head over to the Wized YouTube channel to get a full walkthrough of the Wized and Webflow sides of this clonable. We really hope you find it helpful. Again, big shout outs to Wized for collaborating with us on this project. We super appreciate it. If anybody has any questions, feel free to leave a comment down below. You can also reach out to us through the Xano community or via support chat inside of Xano. Thanks so much for watching, and we will see you in the next one.